Won't be quite so peaceful here this time next week. Palm Sunday, the first day of Holy Week, and here at Walsingham we will have our famous Filipino pilgrimage, always wonderful to witness. But wherever we live in the Catholic world, next week is very, very different from any other week in the entire Christian year. Next week will be swept from one pivotal moment to the next as we celebrate Palm Sunday, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter Vigil. So today, this Sunday, is our last moment of relative peace to reflect a little about what is about to unfold. We heard just now St. John showing us both Jesus' tension and his triumph. And St. John indicates what turned the tension into the triumph. It's interesting that of the four Gospels, St. John's Gospel doesn't tell us about our Lord's agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. You may remember that. The other Gospel writers tell us that Jesus, praying there the moment before he was betrayed, asked for the cup of suffering to pass him by, if it is God's will. He adds, of course, but nevertheless not my will, but thine be done. Well, St. John doesn't have this scene. It's here, in the passage we just heard, that he shows us Jesus fighting his battle with his human longing to avoid the cross. No one wants to die, aged 33, and no one wants to die on a cross. We take Christ's obedience to God for granted, but there would have been no virtue in it if it had come easily to him and without personal cost. Real courage doesn't mean not being afraid. Real courage means being terribly afraid and yet doing the thing that ought to be done. That was the courage of Jesus. God's will meant the cross, and Jesus had to nerve himself to accept it. But the end of the road isn't tension, it's triumph and certainty. Jesus was certain that if he went on, something would happen which would break the power of evil once and for all. If he were obedient to the cross, he was sure that a death blow would be struck to the devil and all his wiles. It was to be one last struggle, which would break forever the power of evil. And further, he was certain that if he went to the cross, the sight of his upraised and crucified figure would in the end draw everyone, all people, to him. Because Jesus too, like the devil, wanted conquest. He too wanted to subdue people. But he knew that the only way to conquer and subdue the hearts of men and women forever was to show himself to them on the cross. He began with the tension. He ended with the triumph. So what came between the tension and the triumph? What changed the one into the other? A voice came from heaven. I have glorified my name, and I will glorify it again. The Jews, let's remember, believed really and fully that God speaks directly to people. We may bring to mind God calling to the boy Samuel as he serves in the temple, and Eli the priest telling Samuel to respond, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." Loads of times we come across the same thing happening. But by the time of Jesus, they'd ceased to believe that God spoke directly. The great days, they thought, were past. God was far too far away now. The voice that had spoken to the prophets was silent. Now all they heard was an echo of his voice, a distant, faint whisper, instead of a direct, vital communication. But it wasn't the echo of God's voice that Christ heard. It was the very voice of God himself. And this is one of the greatest joys and reassurances of our Christian faith, that in Jesus Christ we hear the unmistakable accents of God's direct voice. When we listen to Christ, we hear God himself. That voice came to Jesus at all the great moments of his life. So it came at his baptism, when he first set out upon the work God had given him to do. It came on the Mount of Transfiguration, when he finally decided to take the road to Jerusalem and the inevitable cross. And now he hears it, when his human flesh and blood had to be strengthened by divine aid for the ordeal of the cross. And what God does for Jesus, he does for you and me, for us all. When he sends us on a road, he doesn't send us out without directions, without guidance. When he gives us a task, he doesn't leave us to do it in the lonely weakness of our own strength. God is not silent, and again, when the strain of life seems too much for us, and the effort of his way appears to be beyond our human resources, if we listen, we will hear him speak, and we will go on with his strength surging through our frame. Our trouble is not that God doesn't speak, but that you and I don't listen. On our pilgrimage to this holy place, let's ask of God that supreme grace of being able to listen to his voice and hear it. And let's ask our Blessed Lady to help us to follow her advice at Cana in Galilee, when she says, "Do whatever he tells you. Do whatever he tells you."